Hello, and welcome to our webcast for April 26th, 2019. My name is Amy Hasbrook, and I am with Toujours Vivant, Not Dead Yet. TVNDY is a non-religious organization by and for people with disabilities and our allies. Our goal is to inform, unify, and give voice to the disability rights opposition to assisted suicide, euthanasia, and other ending of life practices that have a discriminatory impact on people with disabilities. Today's topics, we have two and a half, I'd say. United Nations Special Rapporteur on the Rights of People with Disabilities, observations on her visit to Canada, remembering Denise Karuth, and a corrected link. And Christian would usually be here, but he has been sucked into the bottomless vortex that is Canadian Tire. So it's just me today because Taylor Hyatt is doing a presentation today. So you just get me. Okay, so our first topic, the United Nations Special Rapporteur on the Rights of People with Disabilities, observations on her visit to Canada. The UN Special Rapporteur, Ms. Catalina Devendas Aguiar, visited Canada between April 2nd and 11th to gather firsthand information about the status of people with disabilities in Canada and to determine whether disability rights are being respected and to make suggestions to improve compliance with the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. So it was a there were a lot of goals in mind, and she visited for almost 10 days to do those things. On April 12th, the Office of the Special Rapporteur issued some preliminary observations, and a final report will be presented at the 43rd session of the United Nations Human Rights Council in March of next year. So she's going to be elaborating these preliminary observations into a report that will be presented next year. And we intend to write a letter to follow up and thank her for being there and give her some more details on the topics that we discussed. Ms. Devendas mentioned that Canada has ratified the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities and its optional protocol, the Marrakesh Treaty, to provide access to print texts for people with vision and reading disabilities, and most of the other core human rights documents. And in our text that we sent out, we provided a whole list of links to all those human rights documents so you can have them all together in one place, very convenient. And these documents include the International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination, ICERD, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, ICCPR, and the optional protocol to the ICCPR, and the second optional protocol to the ICCPR, which is the abolition of the death penalty. The International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, which is the ICESCR, and its optional protocol. The Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, which is CEDAW, and its optional protocol. The Convention Against Torture and Other Cruel, Inhumane, or Degrading Treatment or Punishment, also known as the CAT, and its optional protocol. The Covenant on the Rights of the Child, that's the CRC, and there are three optional protocols that go along with the CRC. The first is regarding children in armed conflict. The second is regarding the sale of children for prostitution and pornography. And the last is regarding communication procedures. The next is the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, of course, and its optional protocol, which allows people or organizations to bring complaints for violations of the convention to the Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities at the United Nations. So those are some of the documents that she highlighted. And there are other human rights treaties and documents that we included in our list, and there are links again to in our print version. Ms. Devandas, however, noted that Canada has not ratified some important human rights documents, including the International Convention on the Protection of the Rights of All Migrant Workers and Members of Their Families, and that's ICMW, and that's very important because in Canada we have a lot of migrant workers who come to take care of farm agricultural picking crops and that kind of thing. It also hasn't ratified the International Convention on the Protection of All Persons from Enforced Disappearances, the CPED. And Canada has not ratified the optional protocol to the Convention Against Torture, and it hasn't ratified the, I just want to make sure, yes, torture, the Convention Against Torture, and it hasn't ratified the ICESCR, the Social Cultural Treaty. So it hasn't ratified the optional protocol for that one. Ms. Devandas further encouraged Canada to withdraw its interpretive declaration related to Article 12 of the CRPD, which states that Canada reserves the right to continue to use substitute decision-making in appropriate circumstances. So basically, Canada is sticking to the idea that a person with a cognitive or psychiatric disability can be deprived of their right to make decisions through, hi there.
Hi, sorry, I've been delayed. An accident just in front of me.
I told them that you had been sucked into the bottomless vortex of Canadian Tire.
Not the real story. Oh, dog show.
Dog show, okay. Okay. So the Canada is the CRPD provides for an assisted decision-making process for people with cognitive and psychiatric disabilities, rather than the old-fashioned process of appointing of a court determining that a person is incapable of making their own decisions and appointing a guardian. So the idea here is that Canada really should rethink that old idea and go along with this new way of looking at guardianship, so that people, rather than being forced to abide by the will of a guardian, they can choose somebody to help them make decisions. And that's much more empowering to the person and gives them much more control in their lives. The statement is somewhat long and covers a lot of ground, but it's worthwhile to read the whole thing. We don't really have the space to review it thoroughly here, but we will highlight a few important ideas.
There is a link.
Yes, to the statement itself, and to also to the press release that was issued. So the Special Rapporteur points out the limited federal control over matters that are covered by the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, and that only Ontario, Manitoba, Nova Scotia, and Quebec have adopted disability rights legislation.
4 provinces over 10.
Right, 4 of 10, 40%, not such a good percentage.
No, and to be able to sign for Canada to international thing, they have to reach 10 over 10.
Right, exactly. And Ms. Devandas adds that none of these provincial laws actually ensures the rights protected by the CRPD.
Anyway, it tries to do the good thing, but the wrong way.
Right, so even the provinces that have adopted disability rights legislation need to review the legislation to bring it into compliance with the CRPD in order for Canada to fulfill its obligations. And she also criticized the lack of national policy in Canada to coordinate, guide, and monitor the implementation of the CRPD. And she issued a reminder that governments at all levels, including the provinces, are responsible for putting the convention into action as provided in Article 4, parentheses 5. So it's, you know, the provinces could say, well, you know, it's the federal government's job to comply with international treaties. No, it's the province's responsibility, and therefore it's their job to comply with the treaty.
Or comply with the responsibility they have.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, exactly. Ms. Davandas notes that while Canada collects fairly detailed census information about people with disabilities living in community settings, demographic data about the 500,000, that's 500,000 people in institutions, is inadequate, and information about Indigenous disabled people is almost non-existent.
And this is federal responsibility.
Yes.
Okay, and the Indigenous are 100% the responsibility of
the
federal
government. Yes. And the Special Rapporteur also believes that the information drawn from the disability screening questions isn't being used to guide the design, implementation, and monitoring of disability policies and programs. So great, collect all this census information, but don't use it in deciding what kind of programs will be created and used. So that's kind of silly.
Yeah.
But
they have some information, even incomplete. They doesn't even try to use it.
Right, they're not using it. She remarked that in Canada, discussions about the rights of persons with disabilities are still framed in terms of social assistance rather than a human rights-based approach. And that's a direct.
So it's why it's not doing well.
Right. Yeah. I mean, all the best intentions in the world will pave the road to hell.
Yeah.
The Special Rapporteur adds that the non-discrimination guarantees of the Charter of Rights and the duty to accommodate recognized by provincial laws are insufficient to ensure a systemic transformation of society. And that's what we need is a systemic transformation. That's what the CRPD anticipates. And it's not going to happen if it's just up to individual complaints, which we'll talk about in a second. The Special Rapporteur emphasized that all levels of government must remove from individuals the burden of initiating lengthy and onerous legal procedures to achieve the recognition and enjoyment of their rights. So as it stands, people have to file complaints to have their rights recognized and enforced. And that is a pain in the ass, basically.
And sometimes it's not even recognized as a right.
Right. Yeah.
But there is a program who should address it, but partly you never know.
Right, exactly. Basically, she's saying the responsibility is on the governments to change society, not on the individuals to beg society to change.
Okay. At the base, this is kind of simple. What the representative, what is the name again? Mr. Galliani, Mr. De Manera, the name of the representative, the inspector.
Special Rapporteur.
Special Rapporteur, that's the name I was searching. The Special Rapporteur, what she tried to tell, as far as possible, okay, because international relations are not so simple. It says, okay, Canada is a good country. They try to do something, but they do it the wrong way. Please do it the right way. Right. Basically what she tells.
Yes, yes, yeah. Ms. Davandas identified significant disparities in the areas of accessibility and access to education, health, administration of justice, and social protection, depending on the place of residence, and noted that the situation for Indigenous people was particularly worrisome. So what she's saying is, depending on where you live, you'll have better or worse services. And that is not, that isn't kosher within the framework of the CRPD. It's supposed to be uniform across the country.
You just have to look the newspaper. There is always some bizarre story about indigenous people.
Right. And, you know, right now in Ontario, there's a big problem because the government is cutting back on pain management services and on regular injections of pain management or pain blocking.
Yeah. So Mr. Ford, which is a kind of an emule of Mr. Trump,
yeah.
What a guy, he cut everything without looking what it's doing.
Yep. Okay, the section on independent living bears special mention because it relates very directly to what we talk about, and it's also very strongly worded. The special rapporteur is, quote, extremely concerned, unquote, about access to independent living supports.
So, as a diplomatic language,
yes.
Extremely concerned is the highest thing you could say before going to war.
Yeah. So she talks about access to independent living supports is not considered as a right, but rather as a social assistance program dependent on the availability of services, which is ridiculous because provinces are going to spend money either way, whether it's to keep people in institutions or to enable people to live in the community. So why don't they just spend the money to enable people to live in the community? You would think, but they don't. She also said that piecemeal programs and underfunding cause long wait times for services that provide insufficient coverage. And she said people with intellectual and psychosocial disabilities are overrepresented among the homeless
and
population.
Why? Because they close institutions and saying we will give people service at home or in the community, and they never put the service in place. Never, ever.
Right.
So people go to jail most of the time instead to be cured one way or another or taken care.
Right. And sometimes the services are offered in a way that's very coercive to people, and people who've been pushed around by the system so long, they don't want to be coerced by the system anymore. And so they refuse to take the services and they end up on the street.
Yeah. Or in jail.
Or in jail, yes. In the section entitled Right to Life, the exact language and several points are worth noting. And I'm going to read the entire section. It's not very long, but it's very important how it's written. She said, I am extremely concerned about the implementation of the legislation on medical assistance in dying from a disability perspective. I have been informed that there is no protocol in place to demonstrate that persons with disabilities have been provided with viable alternatives to when eligible for assisted dying. I have further received worrisome claims about persons with disabilities in institutions being pressured to seek medical assistance in dying, and practitioners not formally reporting cases involving persons with disabilities. I urge the federal government to investigate these complaints and put into place adequate safeguards to ensure persons with disabilities do not request assisted dying simply because of the absence of community-based alternatives and palliative care.
And to put inquiry to any case is the right and the responsibility of the federal.
Right.
He could not go away from that.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
To rule the thing, that's province. But to inquire, you have the right.
Right. So, a few points to note about this section. First of all, she uses the phrase, it's entitled The Right to Life, not the right to die. And the rhetoric is always about right to die, but in fact, from the disability perspective, which is where the special rapporteur is coming from, it's the right to life.
Yeah, death is not a right.
Yeah.
It's a fact, but life is a right.
Yes, exactly. Also, the Special Rapporteur, again, is extremely concerned. She expresses this level of concern only regarding the right to life and independent living, only 2 areas in the whole report. It is the highest. It is the highest level on the scale of concern. However, this section is not highlighted in the press release that was issued by her office. And, you know, it was probably a matter of diplomacy not to, you know, highlight such a negative part of the report in the press release that was issued when the report came out, but
it's just the diplomacy.
Yeah.
To make sure to not upset the Canada, because we not deny that the Canada have good intention, and he said they said the same, but we are not doing it the right way.
Right. Ms. Devandas notes that people should be provided with viable alternatives, not just informed of the availability of palliative care, which is what the law currently says and what is currently supposed to be happening. And she mentions worrisome claims of institutionalized people being pressured to seek medical assistance in dying. And that would be the Roger Foley case and the Candace Lewis case that we've heard about, and the lack of reporting by physicians. And when I had a chance to talk to her for all of 2 minutes, I talked about the fact that in Quebec, there is some documentation that shows that doctors are not filing their reports.
Because it's possible to deduct it from the fact.
Right. And but at the federal reporting procedures, there's no way to track that doctors are not filing their reports. Okay, and finally, Ms. Devandas urges the federal government to investigate these complaints and to put into place adequate safeguards to ensure that people don't ask for assisted suicide and euthanasia just because they don't have community-based alternatives in palliative care.
Investigation and inquiry is the responsibility and the right of the federal. They could do it anytime.
Yes, and as the safeguards have been written, they're about sort of procedures and protecting, but she's saying that there needs to be viable alternatives as part of the safeguards. And that goes beyond where the law is, and it goes to where the law should be. Okay, so you can send an email to the Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities at sr.disability@ohchr.org. And if you want to send any comments. All right, our second topic is about a friend of mine who died just last week, and this is why we weren't here last week. On Easter Sunday morning, April 21st, 2019, nearly 4 years after a diagnosis of brain cancer, Denise Karuth died peacefully in her own bed, comfortable and pain-free, surrounded by friends and family.
Yeah. She was diagnosed at stage 4 at this time.
No.
What was the stage?
Nobody said there was a particular stage.
I heard from Fred anyway. Sorry.
Oh, no, ça c'était François qui était en stade 4.
No. Fred, tell me, okay?
Okay.
Sorry.
Okay. Like many of us, Denise Karuth was a disability rights activist by default. Her lifelong visual impairment shaped her awareness of barriers in her environment, and her compassionate character made her aware of how discrimination affected other disabled people. Denise learned more directly about architectural barriers when she developed multiple sclerosis in the early 1980s. She unfortunately also learned about negative attitudes about disability from medical professionals, social service professionals, and even loved ones for whom the MS seemed to add an insupportable insult to injury. And there was one doctor who, when she was looking, trying to have her problems diagnosed, The doctor said, oh, it can't be MS. Lightning doesn't strike twice in the same place.
Sorry.
Denise became involved in the independent living and disability rights movements, helping others with disabilities move from institutions to living in their own homes with personal care attendants, and advocating for accessible public transit. Denise served as the chair of the Governor's Commission on Accessible Public Transportation under Michael Dukakis.
It's a known name
Yes.
in USA.
Yeah, he ran for president at one point.
Yeah.
In 1988. To increase her own mobility, she had to advocate with guide dog providers to consider the needs of mobility impaired users, both in how the dogs were trained, for example, to identify curb cuts and locate ramps to building entrances, and the accessibility of their facilities and programs for people who use wheelchairs, because generally those programs you have to go and stay there. But if their buildings are not accessible, then she couldn't use them.
Yeah.
So she had to do a lot of education and advocacy.
And she get few marvelous dogs.
Yeah. Denise was a co-founder and longtime director of the Boston Self-Help Center, which provided a counterbalance to the male-dominated physical disability orientation of the Boston Center for Independent Living by providing independent living skills and peer support to people with cognitive, psychiatric, and sensory disabilities, as well as chronic illness and HIV/AIDS. Denise's personality was both gentle and formidable. She was incredibly generous and was the person who always made sure that everyone's accessibility needs were taken into account. Her faith was a central and essential part of who she was, but even there, she challenged the traditional Christian conceptions of disability. Her ordination as a minister in the United Church of Christ in 2016, upon earning a master's in divinity from the Episcopal Divinity School in Cambridge, Massachusetts, was the culmination of her faith and dedication to the communities of the First Church of Cambridge, as well as the First Church of Northampton. Denise became involved with disability advocates opposing legalization of assisted suicide starting in the mid-1990s, and her passing became a testimony of sorts. She outlived her 16-month prognosis by 32 months. And we often talk about how doctors often get it wrong, and in the case they definitely got it wrong.
3 times the prognosis.
And she showed that it is not necessary to control the moment of death in order to die with dignity.
It was a very smooth and gentle
passage.
Even if that is never funny, that was very respectable, very quiet.
Yeah. All these details of her jobs as administrator or grant writer, as peer counselor, activist and ambassador, mentor and minister, barely scratch the surface of who Denise was, a unique gift to each person who knew her. She was a talented musician and scholar. She was the embodiment of loving kindness, a dog fan and a Trekkie. Denise was tender and tenacious. She was wonderfully imperfect, sometimes too soft, almost naive in her optimism, ready to give away the store. She was luminous and warm and frustrating at times, but most of all, Denise Ann Karuth was beautiful and beloved. And if you want more information about Denise's life and work, there is a link provided in the text. And finally, we have a corrected link. The link that we included in our webcast of April 12th to the summary report of the end of life care in Quebec didn't work.
Sorry.
This one should do the trick. And we're sorry for the error. So if you want more information about the topics that we discuss here, you can visit our Facebook page at facebook.com/toujourdsvivant, not dead yet, all one word. You can visit our website at tvndy.ca. You can send us an email at info@signtv-ndy.ca, or you can follow us on Twitter @signTVNDY. Thanks to Christian for helping out.
Thank you, Annie.
Thanks to you for being there, and we will see you next time.
Yeah, see you soon.
All right, bye.
Bye.